It was an unusually hectic morning at the bustling international airport, where travelers hurriedly navigated long security lines and crowded terminals. Among them was Elena, a seasoned flight attendant known for her no-nonsense attitude and a strict adherence to protocol. With her crisp uniform and perfectly tied scarf, she strode confidently through the terminal, preparing for what she expected to be just another routine flight. But today, unbeknownst to her, would be anything but ordinary. As passengers began to board the plane, Elena stationed herself at the front, her practiced smile firmly in place. She exchanged polite greetings, subtly sizing up each traveler with the quick, discerning eye she developed over years of flying. Most passengers were the usual mix: families, business people, and vacationers. Then, as she glanced at the next pair stepping onto the aircraft, a smile faltered for just a second. An elderly couple approached, moving slowly but with an air of quiet dignity. The man wore a well-worn blazer, the kind that suggested a lifetime of careful choices rather than indulgence, and his wife clutched a small handbag close to her chest. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back, framing a face etched with years of experience. They didn't carry the designer luggage or flashy accessories that Elena often associated with first-class passengers. Instead, their belongings looked modest, practical even. Something about their understated demeanor irked Elena, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the way they hesitated at the doorway, holding up the line behind them. Or maybe it was just the stress of the day catching up with her. "Welcome aboard," Elena said, her tone lacking the warmth she usually reserved for premium passengers. She gestured toward the economy cabin, assuming they'd take seats toward the back. But the man paused, his eyes crinkling with a gentle smile as he handed over 2 first-class tickets. Elena blinked in surprise, her professional facade slipping for a brief moment. She quickly recovered, scanning the tickets with practiced efficiency. "First class is just to your left," she said, though her tone had cooled noticeably. As the couple made their way toward their seats, Elena couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation. First class wasn't meant for passengers like them, also she thought. As the flight progressed, Elena found herself growing increasingly impatient with the elderly pair. They weren't demanding, but their requests, extra blankets, a second glass of water, help adjusting their seats, felt, to her, like unnecessary distractions. She found herself prioritizing other passengers, attending to them first and delaying her service to the couple. Each time they called for assistance, she plastered on a thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, barely concealing her frustration. At one point, when the elderly man politely requested a cup of tea, Elena sighed audibly before preparing it. A younger flight attendant, Lily, noticed the exchange and gave Elena a questioning look. "You okay?" Lily asked quietly as they passed each other in the gully. "I'm fine," Elena replied curtly, brushing off the concern. Some people just don't understand the concept of self-sufficiency. Lily raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she discreetly took over serving the couple, offering them genuine warmth that contrasted sharply with Elena's frosty demeanor. The older woman noticed the difference and glanced at her husband, who gave her a reassuring nod. They exchanged a quiet word that Elena couldn't hear, but their calm expressions seemed almost knowing. Hours passed, and Elena tried to shake off the nagging feeling that something about this couple didn't add up. As the plane neared its destination, she overheard a snippet of conversation between the elderly man and another passenger seated nearby. The man was speaking in a low, measured tone, recounting a story that made the other passenger laugh heartily. It was the kind of laugh that came from genuine admiration, the kind reserved for someone with significant influence or achievements. Curiosity began to gnaw at Elena. Who were these people? They didn't fit the mold of her usual first-class clientele, yet they carried themselves with a quiet confidence that hinted at something more. As the plane touched down, the passengers began to disembark. Elena watched the couple closely. They didn't rush, taking their time to gather their belongings and thank the crew politely. But as they turned to leave, the elderly man paused, reaching into his blazer pocket. What he pulled out left Elena speechless. The elderly man's hand emerged from his blazer with a small, sleek card. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, just a matte black rectangle with no visible logo or branding. But the moment he handed it to Elena, she felt a chill run down her spine. The weight of the card in her hand seemed heavier than it should have been, and the raised, embossed text caught the light just enough for her to notice her name. His name. "This is for you," he said kindly, his voice calm and unassuming, yet carrying an undeniable authority. His wife, standing beside him, offered a warm, almost knowing smile. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but found herself momentarily speechless. The man nodded slightly, as though he understood her reaction, and continued, "We'll be in touch." Before she could gather her thoughts, the couple exited the plane, walking arm in arm with a grace that defied their age. Elena stood frozen in place, the card still clutched in her hand. The name on the card seemed vaguely familiar, but she couldn't quite place where she had heard it before. Beneath it, in fine print, was a title: Executive Chairman, Global Airways Board of Directors. Her heart sank. The realization hit her like a sudden drop in altitude during turbulence. She had spent the entire flight dismissing and subtly disrespecting two of the most important people in the airline's hierarchy. Her mind raced, replaying every interaction, every curt response, every moment she had chosen to prioritize other passengers over them. Lily, who had been tidying up the galley, approached with a puzzled look. "What's that?" she asked, noticing the card in Elena's hand. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's nothing," she said quickly, slipping the card into her pocket. Her face was pale, and her usually confident demeanor seemed to have cracked. Lily raised an eyebrow but didn't press further, sensing that something was amiss. After the passengers had disembarked and the crew began preparing the cabin for the next flight, Elena's mind remained preoccupied. Who were these people really? And why hadn't anyone warned her about their presence on the flight? Usually, VIPs or board members traveling incognito were flagged discreetly for the crew, allowing them to provide extra care and attention without making it obvious. This time, however, there had been no such notice. As the day wore on, Elena's unease deepened. She couldn't shake the image of the couple's calm, knowing expressions, as though they had seen right through her. There was no anger, no reprimand, no indication that they felt offended or disrespected, and yet their silence spoke volumes. That evening, as she sat in her small apartment flipping the card over in her hands, she decided to do some digging. Pulling out her laptop, she typed the man's name into the search bar. Within seconds, the screen filled with articles, interviews, and photos. The man, Richard Hensley, was not only the chairman of Global Airways, but also one of the most respected figures in the aviation industry. Known for his humble beginnings and hands-on approach, he had spent decades building the airline into the global powerhouse it was today. His wife, Margaret, was equally well regarded, a philanthropist and advocate for numerous charitable causes. Elena stared at the screen in disbelief. How could she have missed it? She felt a mix of embarrassment and dread creeping over her. If word got out about how she had treated them, her career could be in jeopardy. Flight attendants were often reminded during training that professionalism and courtesy weren't optional. They were essential, especially when dealing with high-profile passengers, and she had failed. But as she continued to read, something else began to gnaw at her. Why hadn't they said anything? Richard and Margaret Hensley clearly had the power to reprimand her on the spot or escalate the matter to her supervisors. Yet they had chosen to remain polite and composed, even going so far as to thank her at the end of the flight. The memory of Richard handing her the card resurfaced, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "We'll be in touch," he had said. What did that mean? The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. Every time her phone buzzed with a new message or email, her heart raced, half expecting a formal complaint or disciplinary notice from her airline's management. But none came. Instead, she heard murmurs among her colleagues about an important meeting scheduled for the following week. The details were vague, but the rumor mill suggested that some top-level executives would be present. Elena tried to push the thought from her mind, focusing instead on her duties and striving to be extra attentive to every passenger she served. When the day of the meeting arrived, Elena found herself summoned to the airline's headquarters. It wasn't unusual for senior crew members to be called in for briefings or training sessions, but something about this felt different. The email she had received the night before had been terse, providing no explanation beyond the time and location. As she entered the sleek, glass-walled conference room, her nerves were on edge. Seated at the long table were several familiar faces, her supervisors, department heads, and a few other crew members. At the far end of the table sat Richard and Margaret Hensley. Their presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room, and Elena felt her palms grow clammy. Richard was speaking to one of the department heads, his tone measured and thoughtful. Margaret sat beside him, radiating the same quiet confidence she had displayed on the flight. Elena took a seat near the back, hoping to go unnoticed. But as the meeting began, she realized that wasn't going to be an option. Richard addressed the room, his voice commanding yet approachable. He spoke about the importance of customer service, the airline's commitment to excellence, and the crucial role of frontline staff in shaping passengers' experiences. His words were inspiring, but they carried an undercurrent of seriousness that made it clear he wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. Then, to Elena's dismay, Richard looked directly at her. "Elena," he said, his tone even, "would you mind joining us at the front for a moment?" Her heart pounded as she rose from her seat, every step toward the front of the room feeling like an eternity. She stood beside Richard, trying to maintain her composure as the room fell silent. "You were on our flight last week," he said, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Elena nodded, her throat dry. She braced herself for what was coming, the reprimand, the public shaming, the end of her career. But instead, Richard smiled. "I'd like to share something with everyone here," he continued, addressing the room. "During that flight, my wife and I observed something that stood out to us, not just about Elena, but about the culture we've built as an airline." Elena's stomach churned. What did he mean by that? Before she could process his words, he turned to Margaret, who handed him a folder. He opened it and pulled out the document, scanning it briefly before speaking again. "Elena, you've been with us for several years now," he said. "And while there were moments on that flight where you might have fallen short of our standards, what my wife and I appreciated most was your resilience. You stay professional, even under pressure. And that's something we value deeply." Elena blinked, unsure how to respond. Richard's words weren't quite the scolding she had anticipated, but they weren't a glowing endorsement either. She felt the room's collective gaze on her, waiting for her reaction. And then Richard added something that left her completely stunned. Richard paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Elena stood frozen, unsure whether she should feel relieved or more anxious. Her mind raced, replaying his statement and trying to decipher its true meaning. Resilience? Professionalism under pressure? Was he genuinely commending her, or was this some carefully worded prelude to a harsher critique? "What my wife and I noticed," Richard continued, "was how every interaction, big or small, shapes the perception of our airline. Every decision made by our crew has a ripple effect, not just for the passengers, but for the company as a whole. And Elena, while you showed professionalism, we also saw moments where opportunities for connection were missed." The word stung, and Elena felt a lump form in her throat. Opportunities for connection. It was a polite way of pointing out her cold demeanor toward the couple. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but this wasn't the moment for excuses. Her colleague's eyes bore into her, a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment filling the room. Richard turned to the rest of the group. "This isn't about singling anyone out," he said, his voice steady. "It's about using real experiences to reflect on how we can all do better. Our passengers, every single one of them, carry stories, struggles, and expectations onto our flights. It's not just our job to serve them. It's our responsibility to treat them with care and dignity, regardless of how they present themselves." Margaret, who had remained quiet, finally spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. "First impressions can be misleading," she said. "People aren't always what they seem. On that flight, Richard and I weren't looking for special treatment. We wanted to see how the airline truly operates at its core, without the influence of titles or expectations. And what we saw was both revealing and inspiring." Elena's pulse quickened. Her frustration with the elderly couple during the flight now felt painfully short-sighted. They had been observing, silently evaluating not just her but the entire crew's behavior. It was a test, one she hadn't even known she was taking. And while the words from Richard and Margaret weren't overtly harsh, they carried a weight that made her feel exposed. Richard handed her a sheet of paper. "Elena," he said, "this is a list of feedback we've compiled, not just about that flight, but from our passengers over the past year. Your name has come up frequently, and while many comments highlight your efficiency, there's also a recurring theme about warmth and engagement." Elena's cheeks flushed. She glanced at the paper, scanning the comments. Some praised her professionalism and ability to handle challenging situations, but others noted her seemingly detached demeanor. "She's very capable, but a little distant," one read. Another said, "She gets the job done, but I didn't feel particularly cared for." Richard's voice softened. "I want you to know this isn't about punishment. It's about growth. You have potential, Elena, but it's time to align your actions with the values we stand for." Elena swallowed hard, nodding slightly. The room was silent, and she could feel the weight of everyone's attention. She was grateful when Richard shifted focus, directing the conversation toward broader training initiatives and leaving her to return to her seat. But the words lingered, echoing in her mind like a constant hum. Over the following days, the meeting replayed in her head. Richard's calm yet pointed observations, Margaret's emphasis on dignity, and the feedback from passengers all merged into a confusing whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had let down not just the Hensleys but herself as well. As much as she tried to move forward, something about the interaction with Richard and Margaret nagged at her. The way they had tested her without revealing who they were felt deliberate, almost strategic. It wasn't just about evaluating her performance, it seemed bigger than that. But why? The answer began to reveal itself in the form of subtle, almost imperceptible changes. Elena started noticing shifts in how the airline approached its operations. Training sessions focused more on empathy and communication. Policies were adjusted to encourage crew members to engage with passengers on a deeper level. Even the internal messaging from management seemed to carry a renewed emphasis on fostering connection and understanding. It became clear that the Hensleys hadn't just been passive observers during that flight. They had used it as a lens to examine the airline's culture, and Elena's behavior had been part of a much larger narrative. The realization left her feeling both humbled and unsettled. She wasn't just a cog in the machine, she was part of something that could influence the entire direction of the company. One evening, while scrolling through her phone, she received an unexpected email. The sender's name made her heart skip a beat. Margaret Hensley. The subject line was simple, a personal note. Elena hesitated before opening it, bracing herself for whatever message lay inside. The email began with kind words, thanking Elena for her years of service and acknowledging the challenges of being a flight attendant. But it quickly took a more personal turn. Richard and I had spent our lives working to build something meaningful. The email read, "We've seen firsthand how the smallest interactions can leave the deepest impressions. What we observed on our flight wasn't about failure, it was about potential. You have a strength in you, Elena, but sometimes strength needs to be tempered with vulnerability. We hope you'll see this as an opportunity, not just to grow professionally, but to connect with the people around you in a more meaningful way." The email ended with an invitation. Richard and Margaret wanted her to join a new initiative they were launching, a mentorship program designed to bridge the gap between frontline staff and leadership. The goal was to foster understanding, improve communication, and create a more cohesive airline culture. They believed Elena's perspective could be invaluable. Elena stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. Part of her felt unworthy, still haunted by the way she had treated them. But another part of her felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning of something bigger. But even as she considered accepting the invitation, doubts lingered. What if she wasn't cut out for this? What if she failed again, this time on a much larger stage? And why had Richard and Margaret chosen her of all people? The answers felt just out of reach, shrouded in the same quiet mystery that had surrounded the couple since the moment they'd boarded her flight. Elena knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, it wouldn't be easy. But perhaps that was the point. Elena accepted the Hensleys' invitation, though not without hesitation. For days after she replied to Margaret's email, she second-guessed her decision. She replayed every interaction she'd had with the couple, dissecting their words and expressions, wondering if she'd made a mistake in agreeing to work with them. But deep down, a part of her recognized the opportunity for what it was, a chance to prove herself, not just to them, but to herself. The mentorship program began with a series of meetings at the airline's headquarters. The first session was an informal gathering, with a handful of flight attendants, ground staff, and even a few senior managers in attendance. The Hensleys were present, of course, their warm but authoritative presence commanding the room. Richard opened the meeting with a story about his early days in the industry, painting a picture of a young man learning the ropes and struggling to find his place. It was a side of him Elena hadn't expected, and it made him seem more approachable, even relatable. Margaret spoke next, emphasizing the importance of empathy and connection in the airline business. "Every passenger has a story," she said, her voice steady but heartfelt. "And so does every crew member. When we take the time to listen, to really listen, we create an experience that goes beyond just getting people from point A to point B. We create something meaningful." Elena felt a knot in her stomach as Margaret's words washed over her. She thought about all the times she'd rushed through interactions with passengers, focusing more on efficiency than connection. Her mind kept returning to that flight with the Hensleys, the way she dismissed their requests and judged them without a second thought. The memory felt like a weight she couldn't shake. As the program progressed, Elena found herself pushed out of her comfort zone. The Hensleys didn't just talk about fostering connection. They expected participants to practice it. One day, they divided the group into pairs and gave them a challenge. to share a personal story that revealed something vulnerable about themselves. Elena was paired with a ground operations manager named Carla, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp wit and an air of confidence. At first, their conversation was awkward, both women hesitating to open up. But as Carla began to share her story, a tale of juggling her career while caring for her aging parents, Elena felt a surprising connection. By the time it was her turn to speak, the words came tumbling out more easily than she'd expected. She talked about the pressure she felt to always appear in control, how it sometimes made her come across as cold or unapproachable. It wasn't an excuse, she admitted, but an explanation. Carla nodded thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "sometimes the toughest thing to do is let people see the real you. But that's what makes the biggest difference." The Hensleys watched these interactions from the sidelines, occasionally stepping in to guide or encourage. They didn't demand perfection, they simply encouraged honesty. And for Elena, it was both liberating and unsettling. She began to see her role as more than just a job. It was an opportunity to make an impact, to create moments of genuine human connection. But the question lingered, could she truly change? As the weeks went on, Elena noticed subtle but significant changes in herself. She started paying closer attention to passengers, looking beyond their outward appearances to see them as individuals. On one flight, she struck up a conversation with an elderly woman traveling alone. The woman revealed that she was flying to visit her granddaughter, who had just had a baby. Elena listened intently, asking questions and sharing in the woman's excitement. By the end of the flight, the woman thanked her, tears in her eyes. "You've made this trip so special for me," she said. It was a small moment, but it stayed with Elena. She realized that these interactions, fleeting as they might be, had the power to leave lasting impressions. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was looming on the horizon. The Hensleys' mentorship program had an intensity that went beyond mere training. It felt like preparation for something, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. One afternoon, Richard pulled Elena aside after a session. "I've been watching you," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You've grown a lot these past few weeks, but I need to ask you something important." Elena's heart raced. "Of course," she said, trying to sound composed. Richard studied her for a moment before speaking. "Why do you think Margaret and I invited you to join this program?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. I'm not sure," she admitted. "At first, I thought it was because of how I treated you on that flight. But now, I don't know." Richard nodded, as though her response was exactly what he'd expected. "It wasn't just about that flight," he said. "It was about potential. We saw something in you, Elena, something that reminded us of why we started this airline in the first place. But potential isn't enough. It has to be realized." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elena felt a mixture of pride and pressure. She wanted to live up to their expectations, but the weight of their faith in her was daunting. A week later, the reason for the program became clear. The airline was launching a new initiative, one designed to redefine its brand and reinforce its commitment to exceptional service. The Hensleys had decided to handpick a team of ambassadors, employees who would embody the airline's values and serve as role models for their peers. Elena was on the shortlist. The announcement sent shockwaves through the program. The participants had known the mentorship was important, but they hadn't realized it was a test. Now every session, every interaction, felt like a high-stakes evaluation. Elena found herself torn between excitement and anxiety. The chance to be part of something so meaningful was exhilarating, but the pressure to prove herself was immense. As the final selection process approached, the tension among the participants was palpable. Elena poured herself into every challenge, every exercise, determined to show the Hensleys that she was worthy of their trust. But the doubts lingered. Would her past mistakes overshadow her progress? Could she truly rise to the occasion? The night before the final decision was to be announced, Elena found herself unable to sleep. She replayed the past weeks in her mind, questioning every move she'd made. She couldn't shake the fear that she wasn't enough, that she'd fall short when it mattered most. When the morning came, she arrived at the headquarters with her heart in her throat. The Hensleys stood at the front of the room, their expressions unreadable. Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Today," she said, "we'll reveal the names of those who will serve as ambassadors for our airline. But before we do, I want you all to know that this program wasn't just about selecting a few individuals. It was about planting seeds of change, growth, and connection." Our eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Elena. "Each of you has shown us something remarkable. And regardless of today's outcome, We hope you'll carry these lessons with you, both in your work and in your lives." The room fell silent as Richard stepped forward, a list in his hand. Elena held her breath, the tension so thick it felt almost unbearable.